that will bear in enter. Next.
No.
Now, one has to wonder whether these prophecies are to be taken literally, or, as in the case of many of the Maya prophecies, whether they are to be taken in a metaphoric sense. And here I would like to mention, in honor of my dear friends the Britons who are here, about what happens we reminisce about what happens on Mardi Gras. And of course, what happens on Mardi Gras really is a reckoning. It's a framework, I would regard it as, regarding the passing of old ways, about the reckoning and renewal that takes place at the term of all the time cycles, great and small. And so we misbehave on Mardi Gras Eve as we do on New Year's Eve, which mark the endpoints of time cycles. We party and we misbehave, we indulge in wretched excess, knowing that we will atone for our wrongdoing the next day by going to church, making New Year's resolutions, and so on. I know we all broke our resolutions we made about 12 days ago by now. So I think that this whole idea about behavior remodification is part of a ritual that one should tend to think of metaphorically, which is the way most biblical scholars regard the biblical prophecies, such as the one you see here in the book of Daniel. I mentioned it in particular because the 70 weeks are often taken to be 70 days, and 70 days is 1 degree of the movement of precession. So there are many Maya prophets who have grabbed onto this idea. If you don't understand the mathematics of that, don't worry about it. We'll get to it later. Next. Okay, so we've seen just a taste of the kinds of prophecies. There is the galactic alignment, which is supposed to bring about peace and harmony. But on the other hand, there are Lawrence Joseph's predictions about violence, planetary alignments, magnetic reversals, and so on. It would do us some good to sit back and think about a critique for these theories, and I think that they are open to criticism on 2 grounds at least: the anthropological first, and the astronomical second. So I'm going to deal with the anthropological critique by, lo and behold, turning to the evidence. What is it that Maya have to say about time? How do they regard time? What are their time cycles, and what do they mean? And here we have a visual description of 2 modes of expression of temporality in the Maya world. There is the carved monument on the left, of which there are several hundred, now pretty well deciphered thanks to breakthroughs made in the study of hieroglyphic writing some 20, 30, 40 years ago. And the other, the much rarer form, the codex, or written document on bark paper, which you see at the right. These are the evidentiary forms of writing and calendar that we have available to us. So turning first to the stele, here we have a typical monument with a typical inscription, and maybe you can see in the upper right if you're close enough, that is a Maya long count. It's got 3 zeros at the end. The long count is a concatenation, base 20, of time cycles that go up to the 5th order. So by the time you get to the 5th order, you're talking about millions of days. And then when you multiply that by the full cycle of 13, you end up with tens of millions of days. It's 5,137 years all told for a major turnover for everything to go back to 0. But if you take the trouble to read what's on the monument, you'll see, well, let me read it and then see what you think. That monument reads, it is 9 baktuns, 15 katuns, 0 tuns, 0 winal, 0 keen. So that means 0 days, 0 months of 20 days, 0 years. You can see this is a small turnover of 3 zeros. And then 15 scores of years, and then 9 scores of years, a score being 20. And that's how the monument begins. And then there are some other dates that I won't bother to mention, but what's relevant here is what it says, what this time frame reference points out. It says, and then was erected the image of Macaw Mountain Lord, the Lord of Macaw Mountain. There were completed 15 katuns. When he let blood in the image of this god, he, the 13th ruler of the dynasty, was Shak Lahunu Bakawil, Lord of Gopan. Now that's a statement, pure and simple, connecting the ruler of a dynasty to the ancestor gods of the past. And on that occasion, as many other occasions you see depicted in stone, the ruler would let blood by piercing his member with a stingray spine, and here you see him carrying a kind of a double holstered, he's got them in two holsters, double holstered stingray spines ready for use. He would then release that blood, burn it, or his attendants at least would burn that blood on parchment paper. It would soak parchment paper to burn it. The smoke would go up to the gods, and as Michael Coe, anthropologist, once said famously, blood is the mortar that held this culture together. This stela, as practically all the other stelae that we read, are past directed. They are not future directed. And they are mainly directed toward what can only be called statements of political and religious esoteric propaganda, a combination of myth and real history designed to extol the ruler. That's really what these stelae are about. Next. Let's skip that one. Now, it turns out that there are many portrayals on Maya stelae of these bird and tree deities. And here are just a couple of examples taken from Julia Guernsey Kappelman's book about the the pre-classic Maya, or at least Maya on the periphery. She tells us that in many sculptures, the ruler is portrayed as taking on avian aspects. And I always relate that to the dreams we all had when we were kids about being Superman. You go to sleep and you're flying around the universe. And these guys are flying around. And why would you have a ruler flying around? Well, I think perhaps to show to the public that rulers are capable of superhuman powers. You know, that perhaps in a previous life or in the next one they will fly. They will fly to heaven, which of course you can't do. So there are a couple of portrayals of these avian aspected rulers. I'm showing that next to the Stela 25 because this is the argument that Jenkins makes so much of. This is a unique monument showing the Milky Way as it's portrayed standing straight up and down as it does on midnight. Now it turns out, and I will credit my colleague in the front row, Susan Milbrath, the first one to point out that I know of, that the Milky, and I'm embarrassed because I'm an astronomer, the Milky Way does that every year in that season. It does it once a year. In fact, I even push it further and say it does it several nights of the year, as close as you can get it to standing straight up, not once every 5,137 years, once a year or more. And furthermore, and this often comes as jarring news to Maya aficionados, there is no evidence whatsoever that the ancient Maya thought of Milky Way as a tree. Rather, it was a road, the road of the dead, the road taken by the people who walk to go to the hereafter. The notion of the Milky Way as a tree is taken from contemporary Maya culture, may have no connection whatsoever with ancient Maya culture. So the whole argument about the tree and the avian character, not terribly unique, and we'll get to the Milky Way aspect of it very shortly, that is the galactic aspect of it. But I do want to mention that the other form of Maya written knowledge, in addition to the carved stone, is the codex. And in these codices, which are very few in number, you see rituals being indicated, ritual procedure for a sacrifice for debt payment to the gods. They are carefully timed offertory rituals, as you can see by the numbers that appear here, the dots and the bars. Now, for those of you who don't know, the dot's a 1 and the bar is a 5, which are logical extensions of counting with the fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4 points of the fingers. 5, and a 5 is a bar, very likely because you can gesture a full hand this way. But that be that as it may, these are very carefully timed rituals designed to tell us when to offer debt payment to the gods. Payment for what? Well, payment for fertility, payment for sound crops, payment for clearing up this awful bad weather that we're going to have, and in exchange one gives gifts to the gods. This particular page you see the gift perhaps of a crown being offered to a deity in return for having done something for them. So this is very much a participatory cosmology that we're dealing with. This is really all about reciprocity to restore the balance of nature. That's what these rituals are pretty much advocating. So any notion that there's a prediction here about a disaster that's going to happen in the future there's very little evidence for it. But that's not to say the Maya weren't thinking that way. I mean, one has to have the evidence for me to be able to back up the argument. To be sure, there is mention, very rare in the codices and even in some monumental inscriptions, of the previous universe and even of the next one. And here we see the last page, fittingly, of the Dresden Codex, page 74, where you see a scene of what looks like the flood. And I can't help but think of, the Chalmette district of New Orleans when I look at that. And I often say to my friends, if you want to learn about a flood myth, you ought to go talk to people who survived New Orleans. There's a flood myth for you. There's a story about the flood. When I say myth, by the way, I don't mean it's not true. I hope you understand that. I mean, a myth is a story. Here the story is that the sky Chiron, the sky deity, vomits water onto the earth. Water also streams down from these eclipse glyphs and from a vessel held by an old female deity, and here a black warrior with a lance piercing the earth. Now this is a really interesting match, right down to the chocolate brown sky that you read about in the books of Chilam Balam, where this verse comes from. Now the books of Chilam Balam are post-conquest, but it's really interesting to see how well the statements that you read about in colonial times match the picture. Let me read it to you, this translation from Tim Knowlton. And then came the great Chiron sky deity, that this deluge may complete the word of the Khatun overturn, the Khatun prophecy. One fetching of rain, that's the vase. One lancing of rain, that's the spear. I think that really, here I come back to what I said earlier, I think these are metaphoric. These are metaphoric renditions of what might happen if we don't properly make our debt payment to the gods. Although I talked to my co recently, he said, yeah, but I'll still bet you a whole lot of piercing was going on. A whole lot of piercing was going on. So we may disagree as to the degree to which the common Maya person may have worried about this, and I don't doubt there were some who worried, but I think you're getting the point, the message, whatever it is, I don't think it's intended for us. I think it's intended for the Maya, and we can quibble about how the Maya might have reacted to this message of disaster, whether they saw it metaphorically or realistically. But I find it difficult to imagine they're telling us something thousands of years in the future. Now, there also is mention of that creation event in stone. Here you see it on Kirigua's Stela E is 130000, but if you read the fine print over here, you'll see that what it's all about is the setting of the three-stone heart, the setting of the new heart of creation. And if you go and visit the Maya huts all have the hearth stones, the three hearth stones on which they cook their food. I think what we're talking about here is setting up the new heart, setting up the new structure, the new universe, if you will. There is one monument from Tortuguero that vaguely mentions the next overturn in 2012. Interestingly enough, the text that tells what's going to happen is eroded away. But the part of the message that can be deciphered, according to David Stewart at least, says something about the God will come down. The God will come down, and the rest is erased. Yeah, let's skip this and that. I just wanted to show you in those last two I was going to go into detail about how the Maya were perfectly capable of writing long numbers. They wrote numbers into the millions and hundreds of millions. So you could say, well, if they wrote numbers into the millions and hundreds of millions, then maybe they knew about this cycle. And it's quite likely that they could have known about that, but the whole problem always ends up being, is there evidence that they did? And as far as I'm concerned, there isn't. Turning to the astronomical side of the issue, what about all these planetary lineups, these earth-rending alignments of planets, the colossal number of solar flares that might occur in 2012 at the next maximum? Well, the solar physicists tell us, based on their prognostications in 2012-13 will be an average maximum. It won't be much higher than what is normally expected. So what you read in Lawrence Joseph, that this will be the most colossal cycle in the history of solar physics, certainly is not documented. There is a magnetic reversal of the Earth's field going on, but what Joseph doesn't bother to tell you is that the process takes several thousand years to unfold. Yes, it might mess up our radio and other kinds of communications, but it's a long-term process and it's just not going to happen in a sudden flip. And I think this all goes to show you how apocalyptically minded